Thanks for joining us today. For today's session, we decided that we would talk about how we could use data then and help teachers looking at how our students with disabilities are performing. And so that's what our focus is for today. We do have for you a participant folder, and in that participant folder, you'll find all kinds of resources for today. There's the book for high leverage practices. There should be a link for the PowerPoint presentation for today. We've got lots of things about specially designed instruction, and it's just a resource for you all to have and to use as you might need it. You can scan this one and have access to that. And so I'll just start by, this is the data that we pulled here from KVEC. So this is the KVEC region, and we started looking at data, and I'm just going to talk about this briefly as we move into our more focused conversation. But this is for the KVEC region, how our elementary school reading scores for students with no IEP. And so I just wanted to let you kind of just take a second and look at that. So I just wanted to start our conversation with this. And this is our most recent data that we, of course, was released in the fall around how students with disabilities versus non-disabled students were doing. And so you can see those were just arranged by the districts that are in the KVEC area. But you can see on this chart that we see 23.73% of the kids were novice, right, in the KVEC region. So we'll pause right there for just a second. And are there any things else that you notice about this data? One of the things that I would see is that we have seen a decrease in novice, right, for our students with no IEP from the 23 to the 24 school year. So if you look at that gray line across the bottom, you'll notice that those are the totals. So we have decreased novice. We've decreased apprentice, right? And we're looking at elementary reading scores right now. It looks like we've increased proficiency, but we've decreased in distinguished, right? So if we're just thinking about that in the framework of overall data and how we're doing here in this region of Kentucky, that kind of gives us an idea about how our students that without disabilities are doing. And so each individual district is listed there. So your district would be included in the overall data set. But I just want to give you a second. Does anybody else have anything they want a comment about how the reading scores are for students with no IEP? Any other observations? So we did see an increase in the proficient. All right. Now let's take this same data set and now let's look at how students with disabilities are doing. So we're going to flip this one. And now these are students with disabilities. So that's our elementary school. And so you can see it's the same, it's set up the same way. You have the 2024 on the left of the screen. Then we have 2023 and 2022. So we have that 3-year trend data using these graphs. What things do you notice about the students with disabilities?
Novice has decreased quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Novice, we've that was a pretty significant decrease in novice for our region, yes. And again, this is just for our students with disabilities. So what have you noticed about when we decrease novice, where do we see a greater increase?
Like it'd be apprentice.
Mm-hmm. Yep, right. Nikki says the percentage of apprentice, right? So we were seeing that we're moving. Our trend is moving. So our IEP students, they're moving toward apprentice. So we are looking at that and proficiency increased, right? So that overall, it looks like that we comparatively are doing a pretty good job with the way we're moving kids in elementary. This next slide I have actually has just the 2024 connected together. So if you take a look at this slide, I just pulled those 2024 scores for elementary reading for no IEP and elementary reading for that have an IEP. And so you can kind of take a look at that. What do you notice about this data? Probably one of the things I would say about this data is it looks pretty commensurate, doesn't it? It looks kind of like the kids with disabilities are performing at about the same NAPD as the kids without IEP. So when I start looking at that for reading, I'm just trying to think about how does that look overall for our region? How are we doing along those lines? And again, then you could kind of look at how your district level is doing, and then you could think about school level. But those are one of the things that we want to start looking at, is making sure that we look at IEP. One of the things I want to go back to this previous slide and share here is, if you look at 2023, you see those asterisks there. Well, those asterisks are when we have that suppressed data, because we don't have an N size big enough, right, to show that data for the IEP kids. So when we have that issue, then we have to drill down at the individual school or district level and pull our data as well. So sometimes we have to take one further step when we're going to do this comparison for students with disabilities as compared to non-disabled students, especially if we're looking at those subgroups. And for TSI or CSI schools, that's something that we were really looking at, particularly if it's disability groups. And so that means that we may have to take one extra step to dig into the data, or we might have to look at different grade levels. And I have some samples for us to work through for this morning on that one. So let's move on to the next one. So this one is the same thing, except I pulled this one for mathematics. So let's look at our rates. This is no IEP. So these are non-IEP students here. And I'll pause right there and let you all make some observations. What are you noticing about our trends?
We're not really moving kids to the proficient and distinguished level. We're getting a few kids out of that novice, but they're still stagnant in that proficient and distinguished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're kind of getting them to there, and we're kind of hung there and not moving on up. So that's a real good observation.
The apprentice category has increased.
Yeah.
But like Nikki said, moving to proficiency is what we're after.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to advance to the next slide, and we're going to talk about this same data, but we're going to look at our IEP students. So that's what we're looking at elementary math. And what do you notice here? Well, one of the things I would notice is that our distinguished rates for IEP students are a little bit higher than for the 2024 than they were in 2023. So we've moved some students, we've decreased proficiency by just a small, but we're running pretty commensurate, right, with last year. I don't see any huge gains or anything that really stands out. Anything that you all notice about this graph, this chart? One other thing that I would just comment on is looking at that 2023. Do you see those asterisks? Means that there was those districts had suppressed data, right? And so sometimes we get that suppressed when we look at our overall scores, especially if you're a small district. You have, depending on the size of your district, you may not have those N size again to represent students with disabilities, and that's when again you have to move to that. You have to move down into drilling down at that school level. And so I'll show you this. This one's just the comparison with the no IEP versus IEP. You might have any thoughts about that one? So I see we have more novice for our students with disabilities. It's between a 26.80 and a 30.31. So we have more novice, but for no IEP, we have more apprentice. Right, we have a little bit more into the distinguished category. So those are all things to start thinking about, right? When we start thinking about overall achievement and the big pieces of data that we have, we really want to think about how's our kids with disabilities doing compared to our students that are non-disabled students. Here's another one for middle school math, and we'll just do middle school math and then we'll move on to some more samples, but I'll let you all take a look at this one. This is no IEP for middle school math. If I was thinking about the middle school math, I would probably do 29.87 and add the 9.67. And I'm thinking about, looks like we have about a 39.54% of proficient and distinguished, right, for this region. And one of the things I would start looking at is, so I noticed that we've decreased our novice here, but one of the things I might want to look at is how, if we have around a 40% proficient and distinguished rate for non-disabled students, how are we doing for students with disabilities? right? And so I'll click to this next one. And again, you'll see that real quick glance, that's suppressed data. But just off the cuff, it looks like there's what, 24 and 10, about 34%. So we're seeing a little smaller percentage of our students with disabilities that are proficient and distinguished, right? Again, we're just kind of looking to see how how our performance is as compared for disabilities and non-disabled students. So I did the same graph like I did for the other slides here, so you can kind of see that side-by-side comparison for this last year. Any observations about this one that you'd want to point out?
Much higher rate of novice for IEP students.
Right. That is a lot higher rate for IEP students, almost 10%, right? So we're seeing a pretty, so that's pretty significant. That would definitely be something that you want to look further into, like an additional data dive or a focus to look to see what areas is that, right? We're looking at middle school math. So we know then in middle school, our students with disabilities are going to maybe they're performing lower than the other students. So we're going to start thinking about what are we going to do around the instruction? How can we continue to support that, that learning? And that, you know, we want to move them as close as we can to proficiency. We want to move kids. So with the supports that they have in the classroom, how can we look at instruction and improve instruction, especially design instruction? How can we use some of the strategies that we know to scaffold instruction, to give them a lot more support. Again, so that kind of gives us an idea about how we start moving toward that focus and looking at students with disabilities. So this one, I just created this one. This one's not a specific district, but let's say we take that school level data. So this one, let's say this one is your school level. So as administrator, let's say this is what we have. And so you'll see on the left column, you'll see the 2023, 24 KSA data. You'll see that how third grade performed, fourth, and then the map data is in the middle. So you'll see if you look across the third grade, fourth grade, you'll see that the last year's third graders would be this year's fourth graders. So I'm going to let you take a look at this data set because we're looking at all the way across. We're considering behavior, we're considering attendance, but we're looking at overall performance. As you make observations or notice things, please feel free to share a comment about that. So one thing to start thinking about is, as I am glancing across, I'm trying to look to see the KSA data. How are our kids doing in the spring? And then, you know, they've of course returned, they've come back to school, they're in the next grade level. We're looking at the fall. So we now have our fall and our winter benchmark data, right? So those are some things that we start looking at, the benchmark data. And so we look to see how we're doing in the fall and the winter. But in the behavior column, I'm noticing, what do you notice about the incidents? So the number of behavior incidents, what do you see there in that column? Something here I'm noticing is here, and feel free to just jump in, right? But look, can you all see that on my screen? I'm noticing that there are an increase of behavior incidents. And where do I see those most commonly occurring at?
Middle school.
In the middle school. So I might start looking backward, kind of a backward design, and I'm looking here, and the first thing I might see is right here, all through this middle school, I'm looking to see the number of distinguished, right? So we're right, and I'm going to start looking backward. How are we doing at proficiency? And what I'm noticing is, look at that, look at those numbers there. We have a high rate of novice, right? So I'm going to start looking then to see if that high rate of novice, we have low proficiency on our MAP assessments. We're looking at an increase in behavior. How is attendance? And I just included that. You can use STAR data. You could use any other data set that you wanted to use, particularly whatever you're looking at. You may have, say, the children that does a program with you. You may have a reading intervention program that you're tracking data on that you can add. but we're just kind of looking at that school level, right? So we started thinking about how are we overall performing for our kids with disabilities as compared to our non-disabled students. Now let's look at our school. How are we overall performing at the school level, right? And then if I'm going to notice that sixth grade, for example, fifth, sixth, seventh grade, I'm seeing a lot of increase in behavior, and I'm not seeing such a good performance in academic, in the NAPD for my benchmark assessments. I'm going to start looking at that. What's going on in there, in those areas? What supports do students need? If I'm thinking about having gear up tutors, that might be where I start thinking about moving the gear up tutors at, or shifting the people that I have. That, some of the region got grants, like those PRI grants, and they have tutors. I'm going to start thinking about what does that look like, about where am I going to put the people at? And then you start looking at those numbers of behavior incidents. What do you notice in relation then to the attendance on this data set? And that would be percentage by 9 weeks. So the first one would look at, third grade overall had about a 90% attendance rate the first 9 weeks. The second 9 weeks was about 92. So what observations would you make here?
Students aren't at school to learn to make gains.
Mm-hmm. So that's right. And particularly, you're looking at these attendance rates here for the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, or 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. Students are not at school. So then how many of those students have disabilities? Or do we have high numbers of students with disabilities in those subgroups? In that 6th grade, I'd start looking at that. How of our students with disabilities? Who's not attending? And when you see those behavior incidents, you see, like for 6th grade, you see 22 incidents. That could be a few students that are having multiple incidents. So those are some other things to start thinking about. Because when we get to the point where we're looking at that school level data, we've looked at that big aggregate data, then we move to our school, and we're really trying to dig in. If we're a small school district, we don't have those individual data sets, right? We don't have that aggregate data for our disability students. So we're going to have to take another step and dig into that data, right? So we're looking for patterns and trends in our data sets right now. Any comments or thoughts about that? And we could just talk a little bit about that. Do you think we've already you all have already done this kind of part of the work? Or is that something that you think would be helpful for teachers at your school to move into this kind of data set work?
Dionne, we do this at my school after every benchmark, and we start looking at, do kids need to be moved into RTI because they are only, have a specific learning disability, or, they placed in reading but not in math. Do we need to put them in RTI for math? We do this after every benchmark.
Right. So and that's a good way to do that. So we're thinking about every time we have a benchmark, we add that data and we revisit that. We're continuing to look for those patterns and trends. Thanks, Nikki. That was a good comment, because we're teaching them as you all are the instructional leaders, and you're kind of teaching and helping them facilitate those data discussions. So that's wonderful. Anybody else want to share anything before we move on? So now let's take a look at this slide. Okay, so this slide is, so I'll tell you a little bit about how we arrived to think about this. So I was working with a teacher, and we were talking about that aggregate data versus that suppressed data for our IEP students. And so let's say this was a 6th grade class, and this particular, I only use 7 for this example, but this is a special education teacher's caseload. So this data on the map, or on whatever assessment that you use your benchmark data, this is the data they collected. And let's say this is for reading, for example. We'll say this is for reading. When you look at the data, the special ed teacher, or the teachers that are in those teaching teams, like you were talking about, Nikki, as you guys revisit it, let's start moving toward, then we're going to drill down even further from that school level data to that caseload data. And the special education teachers are looking at how their students with disabilities are performing. And so if they look at each student, and I just named them student 1 through 7, but if they look at each student, look at their fall map. And this is an actual teacher shared this data with us. So if you look at 7 students 1 through 7, what do you notice about their fall benchmark data for their students? This was a 6th grade group. And so the X just indicates where they performed that on that fall assessment or in the NAPD. So what do you see there?
Just a lot of novice.
Mm-hmm. So when the teacher pulled the individual scores, because we have those individual scores, that's what she started looking at. And we said, let's work through a table or a graphic of some sort, and let's create just something that a visual for us as we work through that to see kind of how students are performing. So all of the kids on that caseload performed novice on the fall benchmark assessment. Then we looked at how they did on the winter assessment. And so you can see in the middle column, what do you notice there?
Their behavior decreased.
Mm-hmm. So their behavior decreased, yes.
And if you look at the 2 students that did move, one's attendance was better than the first 9 weeks. So they were there to get the assistance.
Right. That's right. So we were looking at those trends. And so this particular special ed teacher was trying to learn how to drill down. She had never taken that that benchmark data and broken it down like that with the fall, the winter, the spring, bringing in those behavior incidents and looking at that attendance overall. So if this school was a TSI school or a CSI school because of because of disability, that's a pretty telling pieces of information, right? That gives us a lot of information about how that particular group of students is doing. So when you look at that, what would you think would be some good next steps to do for if you were the special ed teacher, and this was happening at your school? What do you think that you would recommend for them to do? Let me just kind of reframe that question. I'm noticing that on the fall benchmark, they were all novice. We moved to winter. There were many of them that were still novice, but 2 of them had moved to apprentice. We've been working on behavior. They were working on attendance. But what are we seeing there? Are we seeing this pattern of novice performance or novice and apprentice performance? Is that kind of what we're continuing to see? Would you agree with that?
With only 2 students moving out of 7, I would say we're still on that novice performance.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to figure out how to move all students. And one of the first things I would do as an administrator is to figure out why they're not coming to school.
Mm-hmm. You want to start looking at attendance? Absolutely. You may even start with some attendance plans or some plans to how you would address that for students, because there's some of the students that are having some pretty low attendance.
And I could add too, from a compliance standpoint, when you start to see those attendance drops like that, that is something that you need to, if it persists, you need to convene an ARC meeting and get that into a change within that IEP, because the information is pretty clear to us and the guidance is pretty clear to us that when attendance drops amongst those students, that is a child find issue. So that's something that can be additional on your IEP. If you're working on math and you're reading, but then they're not coming to school, then that's a behavioral issue possibly. So that's something we need to think about as well.
Yeah, it kind of springboards our next steps and what we think that we need to do to helping students. So when I think about performance for students with disabilities, so we're saying that these children have been identified with a disability that and they need specially designed instruction, right? So then we're starting to think about the instructional piece of that. So what happens sometimes is we spend our time in the classroom providing accommodations and modifications for students, but can we really look at the instruction side of that, right? So that's what I would start thinking about right here is, are the instructional supports, whether it's in the resource room, but particularly in the co-teaching classroom, are those supports adequate? Are we seeing students make any gains? What is that rate of gain? But we want to have special ed teachers and regular ed teachers looking at how students with disabilities are doing. And we're going to start thinking about, when they write an IEP, they're looking at a goal that's what a reasonable goal for a year out for how that's the growth for that student. And as part of that, those goals, they identify what special instruction that student might have. So in the spirit of the way we do continuous improvement, we always are wanting to look, is that instructional method that we have selected, that special instruction that we chose for those students, is that tailored to that student, and are they making gains? So when we start looking at those data sets, we're starting to see those patterns. That is an opportunity then to shift to really focusing on not just how we're accommodating, making sure that we're reading to them every day, or making sure that we're modifying the way we do assignments, or we're giving them, 10 spelling, a list of 10 spelling words, but are we teaching them the skills necessary to make that academic growth? And so and not always do we know how to break down that skill that's expected for that grade level, and then backward design that so that we're teaching the skills for our students with disabilities, because we're still wanting them to have, growth. We want that to be challenging and an opportunity for them to continue to learn. So then we really start thinking about our instruction. How do we shift that instruction so that and how do we make sure that that instruction is tailored and focused so we're seeing growth? And so that's what part of our session today is how we start. Once we realize that our students with disability, however our students with disabilities are performing, how are they, we think about that overall level. What does it look like at our school level? But when we start then drilling down in that for special ed teachers and regular ed teachers that are serving those students, if our instruction's not working, how can we reevaluate the strategies that we're using and then choose different evidence-based strategies? And so the next segment of the work that we're going to do this morning is Mr. Denny May is going to talk about how we focus on that specially designed instruction and what that looks like and what you might see as you're in those classrooms. So I'm going to
and Nikki
advance this slide. Okay.
Nikki just said in the chat there that, we look at our co-teaching strategies,
Absolutely.
and so that's a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about. But, that's a big part of it. And so, you can go ahead, Dr. Bates.
All right. I will. And I thank Nikki for saying that, because that's where we really, we have to look at how's the instruction look in those classrooms. And most of our kids, look at the co-teaching and how often those kids are in that class. And I know Mr. Murray's going to talk about that, but most of our kids are in the regular ed setting most of the day. So how can we shift that instruction? And one last thing before I pass it off to Mr. May is that we know that strategies that work for disabilities work for all students, but not all strategies work for students with disabilities all the time. And so when we can tailor those special instructions, it's really going to help those kids that are in the gap. And you get a lot of that incidental benefit of using those evidence-based strategies and practices. And I'm going to turn this over to Mr. May.
Yeah. And so, talking about co-teaching, talking about specially designed instruction, one of the things that we hear when we're in the hills and hollers of this region is that, our demographics changing some, and some of the, students that come to us, have a myriad of different problems, and, their learning problems, their behavior problems, they're coming to us from backgrounds that, are different. And so as we plan, when we start to think about, moving students with disabilities, we also need to think about the entire room and the makeup of the room, and understanding the profile of the student, and how we're going to address that. And so, I would hold that a lot of the teaching that we do, when we start with those differences in mind, when we plan that way, then that's going to catch everyone. that's going to, you talk about incidental benefit. You don't necessarily have to have an IP flag to benefit from some of these strategies that we're talking about. And it hit me pretty hard a few years ago. We were here and we were conducting we had a group of special ed teachers, and they were experienced special ed teachers, not the brand new special ed teachers, but the MAT crew, the MAT group. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a group of people that had several years of experience, and they were here doing some innovative projects with us. And we asked them the question, how do you spend the majority of your time? And they were to say that the majority of their time in the classroom was spent accommodating students and helping them, keep up with the content within those classes. And so what we're going to propose here is that as we think about our classrooms and how they've changed, how can we not only take some of the things that we've learned that work with students with disabilities and apply that to all students? And I think that's where we get the biggest bang for our buck. And that's what we're after, because students with disabilities certainly fall into these novice and apprentice categories lots of times, but we have other student populations that fall in those categories as well. And so when we can flip the grid and think about those differences first, then I think we can really gain across the board in our not only our test scores, but what our students are actually learning. And what we're after in instruction is that students are actually learning, that learning is transferring, and they're becoming independent. So as we get into this, when we talk about specially designed instruction is really, it's rooted in the law. First of all, students that have IEPs, they're the students that get specially designed instruction. Yes, students with IEPs get a lot of other things, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But here's when we define specially designed instruction from the current 2006 regulations, it's really adapting the content, methodology, and delivery of instruction. And it says, if you look really hard at this definition, to address the unique needs of the child that result from the child's disability. And the child's disability may provide you with a list of needs that are more varied than just reading. It may be executive functioning. It may be their inability to see the print. It can be a lot of different things that emanate from that disability. And so when we think about what are our special ed teachers doing as principals, we need to know what is it that you're doing that's special in that classroom to adapt the content, the methods, and the delivery of instruction so that we can show that our students are getting the things that they need to make these gains, and that our test scores then will be the residual of that, and that we can move to a greater level of mastery and a greater level of transfer. And, teaching and learning is an interactive process. And so in order to adapt that content, methodology, and delivery of instruction, we need to keep those children's needs in mind, and we need to match our strategies to those needs. And that's what specially designed instruction is all about. And so you can advance. And in compliance, if an ARC determines that a student needs specially designed instruction and we fail to provide it, then we're not implementing the IEP. If we're just doing accommodating, we just have a caseload full of 504 students. If accommodations are all they need to make progress and pass classes and make it through, then we're missing the point of specially designed instruction. We're missing the point of special education. If the ARC determines that a student needs special designed instruction, it's not being delivered, and we only provide accommodations, then we have a caseload full of 504 students. And that's something I want you to think about as you go into these classrooms and you're doing your walkthroughs and you're doing your, because the principal's job in the law, the responsibility is to oversee and be able to oversee that specially designed instruction. And so that's what we're, that's one of the main responsibilities. And then when we also look at this statistic, 64% of students with disabilities spend 80% of their day in the general education classroom. And we're not just talking about, students with intellectual disabilities. We're talking about students that have SLD, specific learning disability, that have other health impairments, and they have higher intellectual capacities. But we're still missing the mark, and they're still falling into those categories that we don't want to see with the test scores that Dr. Bates highlighted so much for us early on in this presentation. So 64% of students with disabilities spend 80% of their day in the general education classrooms. And what I hear is that, and when I hear things like I highlighted earlier, that our special ed teachers spend the majority of their time just accommodating, we're not really teaching students. We're putting a Band-Aid on the problem. Now, it sounds like I'm saying accommodations are bad. Accommodations are not bad. Accommodations are good. And so I pulled this slide from a website a few days ago, and it really highlights what we do here as far as specially designed instruction. Teachers design, provide, and assess the effectiveness of specially designed instruction to provide students with disabilities access to participate. And when you go back to the definition a few slides before, it says they're going to meet the standards. It doesn't say that they're going to do okay. It doesn't say that they're going to get through. It says they're going to meet the standards. And so when we provide specially designed instruction, that's the intent. And then the other piece for improving results for students with disabilities is research-based instruction. And so that we're going to look at that a little bit as we move through. At exactly how do we know what's research-based, and how do we know what's going to come about as a result of our instruction? And do we know that what we're using actually works for students with disabilities and with all students? And so is there a research base? Is there a peer review to that? Is it evidence-based? Is it a high leverage practice? And you'll hear us talk about all those terms. So I want you to read here and reflect. And if you want to, you can put your comments in the chat, or you can unmute. We've got a small group. Unmute and feel free after you read these three statements to share some of your thoughts and your reflections.
The last statement on the high expectations resonates the most with me, because those kids will work hard to meet those same expectations as students that do not have an IEP. And we have seen, some of those kids really excel in that classroom because they have been shown that teacher efficacy, that they can work and they can do just as much as everybody else in the room.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much, Nikki. I just think about the analogy of the glass half full, the glass half empty kind of thing. And I want to look at that glass or that student, that vessel, and I want to look at them and see all the potential that they have. And we're going to work our tails off to make sure that we push those students to reach those high expectations. And we're going to start by we're going to love them, and they're going to be invited to the table. We had Dr. John Hattie here this summer. And I don't know how many of you were able to catch that presentation, but one of the things he talked about is the students need to feel invited to the table. And so that's huge. And I appreciate your comments. Any other comments from any of our wonderful principals that we have joining us today and directors of special ed? Love to hear from you.
Bullet number 2, I find that a lot of just regular ed teachers think that that's kind of not part of their job. Like, I'm just going to teach how I teach, and they don't get it, and the special ed teacher would work with them. And really what you're doing when you do that is, you're going to have novice students, you're going to have apprentice students. So it's really killing their data to think that way.
And it is killing their data, but it's also one of the, I'm a compliance guy and I drive you guys nuts with that sometimes. When I talk to you about this is rooted in the law, but it really is rooted in the law. Universal design for learning is part of the ESSA law. And it's mandated that students get differentiation, that students get universal design for learning, that we account for differences, and we look at our classroom and we see, if we can understand that if we hit the corners of the room and we hit the students with the most difficult problems first, that most of the research says that we're going to get the rest of the students. The rest of the students are going to learn. They're going to learn at a high level. There's nothing wrong with the strategies being bent toward those students that have the most difficulties, and that's going to help the overall. And so that's really, I appreciate that, Danielle. Danielle Atkins doing a great job up at Burdine Elementary and Jenkins Independent. And anyone else have any thoughts on some of these? Or did anyone put anything in the chat? I don't know. We don't have anything in the chat. So if to give just another minute or so just to think about it, and anybody want to unmute and talk to us, we'd love to hear what you had to say, because it just makes for a better meeting. It just really does. So, okay. So I guess we can move on.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Mr.
Dr. Bates.
I just wanted to add one more comment. We think about teachers that are in the general ed setting, and we train all the time through the special education lens, special education teachers on specially designed instruction. We give them a lot of support. We do a lot of training on those things. But are we supporting general ed teachers who have those children in the classroom all the time with what is special instruction? And even though that's initially delivered by the special ed teacher, the regular ed teacher is still there to implement that when the special education teacher is not in that classroom. And we think about that through the co-teaching setting. So it could be that we think about how can we support our general ed teachers as well, especially, if they are, they maybe have not had a lot of pre-service work or learning about working with students with disabilities. So I just think, they maybe had an introduction to special education class or something like that, but maybe they don't have any other training specific to specially designed instruction beyond that. So that could be a consideration when we're looking at, how we're performing, how our students with disabilities are performing, how are we supporting both groups of teachers. And I think Nikki said that back when you first this conversation about that co-teaching strategy. How are we supporting them both with instructional strategies that are evidence-based, that are specially designed for students, and then how are we supporting them around the implementation? And then one other question, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go through, but how does that look? How do special ed teachers implement specially designed instruction in the regular ed setting, in that co-teaching setting? So those are all things I think to think about and consider, and we can just extend that offer that if you have, you're working with teachers or you have teaching teams, and we can support them and help them along the way, or you can reach out and find resources that'll help both of those groups of teachers. So I just don't want to leave regular ed teachers out, because sometimes we spend all our time teaching the special ed teachers about that piece. We just want to remember them.
That's a great point. And so I think the key point here is that as we think about this, and here's the slide with ESSA. ESSA refers to core instructional and assessment practices that overlap certain practices used to provide SDI. So, when students have an IP, we know that the law says that they get something special. They get something different from all of these things that you see on the screen, but they also get parts of these things as well. And sometimes providing specially designed instruction is a combination of providing universal design for learning, giving them multiple ways to represent what they've learned, giving them choice, providing them with multiple representations of the content. And, the evidence-based practice, the differentiated instruction, the data-driven decision-making, multi-tiered systems of support, that's all rooted in the ESSA law. So when, it's not just, can we do it? It's that we should be doing it. And so when we get more comfortable with that, and regular and special ed teachers are having those conversations about how can we extend this lesson? How can we, what's the hard parts here? And what can we do to really incorporate all of these strategies within our teaching, so that every student in our class is seen as important, and that we can, maximize learning. That's what we're after. The whole point of education, my favorite teacher in the world, Anita Archer, will say, the point of education is learning. That's all that matters. Now, the residual of that is going to be that you're going to see those numbers change. The novice are going to become apprentice, and the apprentice are going to become proficient, and the proficients are going to become distinguished as we hone in on the things that we need to be doing in terms of creating lessons that hit the edge of the room as opposed to bowling right down the middle with the bowling ball, and always teaching the same way and doing the thing and expecting different results. We know what the definition of that is. And you've heard that old adage, you keep doing the same old thing time after time and expect different results. And it's not going to happen until we really put a premium on the fact that our demographics different, but students are still the same. They want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to learn, they want to be successful, and they want to be invited to the table. And so that's huge in terms of that. So we can move on. So when we look at SDI is on the left here, we got what it is and then what it's not. SDI is adapting content, methodology, and delivery of instruction. It's unique to the disability, and it's supposed to provide access to the general curriculum and allow you to meet the standards. So all the things that we do special for our students is supposed to allow them to meet the standards. Now, we can say it's not in isolation. It's not just differentiation. So all students get differentiation, including students with IEPs. It's not just providing accommodations. It's not reading for our students. It's not providing a calculator for our students or providing a graphic organizer and just handing it to them and expecting them to be able to use it. Those are the things that we're talking about. So specially designed instruction in and of itself is not these things in isolation. But when we do specially designed instruction, we can jump over and grab things from the right-hand column and help to bolster what we're providing for our students. Universal design, tiered instruction, and evidence-based practices are where we need to be focusing our attention. And as principals, we need to think about, hey, can we identify evidence-based practices? And when we go in those classrooms where special needs teachers are co-teaching, what are their responsibilities? Are they just accommodating, or are they really having a plan to extend that lesson? And then we're going to get into it. And one of the things that I've done in the last few years is I've really focused on this book by Ann Benninghoff. And the book is, so some of the number one questions to get, how do we do specially designed instruction? The content is pretty set. We have Kentucky academic standards, and we have to move at a pace that sometimes doesn't take into account the needs of students and all students with disabilities. So how do we do it? So we can move on so when we look at this, I wanted to just share with you today some of the things that we see as important when we are planning for SDI. And when our students can learn this, or our teachers can learn this, our teachers of special education, our teachers of regular education, general education teachers, when they can learn this and work together on these things, then you can see that the classroom is a much more lively place. It's a much more place. It's a greater place of learning. Is what it is. And so one of the first things that Benninghoff highlights is when we're starting to think about that general ed teacher and that special ed teacher having a conversation, do we know how to clarify the learning target? Can we make the learning target come to life? And when we provide that knowledge of what is expected of the student, are we making sure that we're making it accessible to all students? Are we providing it in different ways? Is it student-friendly language? Are we doing those types of things? So this is the overall process, pinpointing difficult moments in the lesson. We all know that when we teach a lesson, if we're teaching fifth grade and we're teaching main idea, we know, but if we've taught that year after year, we know that general ed students and special ed students have difficulties in certain places with that very difficult task. And so when we can pinpoint those difficult moments, and then we can look at capturing what a successful learner does, and we can teach that to our students through specially designed instruction, then we've done something different that is going to make a difference. we also in our steps, it says we're going to assess what we're going to do here. We're going to clarify the learning target. We're going to pinpoint the difficult moments, and then we're going to choose carefully what IEP goals we can address within that lesson. And so, in order for it to be specially designed instruction, it has to be intentional to the goal. And then as we move down the line there, Benioff talks about identifying the metacognitive processes. And metacognitive is a big word. It just means, can the student think and reflect and pause and really think about how they're learning, what are the steps that they're taking to the learning, and can they capture that in ways that make sense? And one of the things that she talks about is, and we'll get to it here in just a second, is how we teach students to think about their learning. And then adapting the general approach. How are we going to take each lesson and adapt it so that it's accessible to all? And then another thing that Benioff made me think about that I hadn't really thought about is these little mini lessons that attend to access skills. These things like, if a student has trouble planning or with time management, or if a student has trouble with impulse control, or if a student has working memory issues, how can we incorporate things from the psychological that tells us what the problems are and transfer that into something, a strategy that we're going to work on? And then the last thing, she talks, and I got it a little bit bigger down there, can boost participation. How are we going to boost participation? And the number one thing that we learned last month when we, or a couple months ago when we met with Dr. Terry Scott, is that we need to see an increased amount of opportunities to respond. And we need to allow our students to have lessons that are designed to have them active. And being active means they're responding. They are, I'm going to say something, you're going to say something. I'm going to use a choral response. I'm going to use signals I'm going to use response cards. I'm going to use lots of different kinds of things to boost that back and forth. That teaching and learning process comes to life when we have additional opportunities to respond. And what happens when we have additional opportunities to respond, and what happens when students are engaged? The principal gets called less about the behavior that's going on in the classrooms. And so we got to make sure that the corners of the room are responding. The corners of the room are having lessons that are designed to allow them to respond. So I'm going to break it down just a little bit further and we can go on. So when we clarify the learning target, what do we want our students to be able to know by the end of the period? Is the verb that we're using, is it flexible or constrictive? Now, the Andrew case taught us that our goals need to be ambitious. Okay, we need to be moving students to higher order thinking. And so if we always are just stuck on identifying things and recalling things from Bloom's taxonomy, we need to think about how can we clarify our learning targets, make our learning targets accessible, but also how can we build in some ambition into those learning targets. And then pinpointing difficult moments that students may experience. What has been the challenge in the past with this lesson? What do we expect to be challenging? Based on our data, what do we know that makes this a difficult task? Lots of times our students with disabilities, when you look at the psychological and you dive deep into that IQ test and those 5 areas, one of the things that we see is working memory is impacted. So if they're having difficulty with vocabulary or remembering math facts, we've got to remove some of that and we've got to account for that. And we've got to pinpoint those difficult moments. And we have to make the learning accessible to them, either by providing them an accommodation or teaching them how to overcome these difficulties, practicing memory and practicing retrieving information from a blank slate is something that's so super important. And then the third part, choose IEP goals to address during the lesson. Which goals are most closely aligned with the curriculum? Are there other goals, behavioral or communication, that could be addressed? Can we combine those goals And can we work on access skills? Can we work on social skills? And also work on math at the same time. We have to think outside the box, and we have to try to combine some of these things, because we may have 7 or 8 students in a class that has IEPs, and they have different kinds of things going on. So we really have to have intentional planning, and we have to look at those goals, and we have to look at the content of the lesson and be able to combine those things.
We have a comment in the chat, and it's
Okay.
goes along with that. It says, this is why it's so important for resource teachers to plan with gen ed teachers to give that input on how to get IEP students involved in the learning.
And I would agree with that, Nikki. Nikki, up at Duff Allen Elementary, that's a great comment, and it starts with our supervision. It starts with our intentional planning ahead. When we set the schedules, when we're working with folks, and also making sure that there's time built in for student or teachers to have that shared and common planning time is so vitally important. You have comments?
I just was going to say, sometimes it's hard, like Nikki was talking about earlier, about co-teaching and how you can get those specially designed, and how the SDI could look in that classroom. And that's an opportunity there, again, to think about what the IEP goals are, how those 2 teachers can be working, the regular ed and the special ed teacher can be working together there too. So I think that's just a good way to think about how you can do more things with good planning. You can really accomplish a lot of goals that way. So.
Yeah. And I was listening to Dr. Benninghoff talk about that this morning in a little podcast, and she was talking about how a lot of times if she knew that students were having some verbal comprehension issues, and if they were having memory issues, she would start the lesson with a little mini lesson to kind of recover, and reteach or pre-teach, and in that bell opener, in that bell ringer, in that opening part of the lesson, she was working toward some goals, but she was also getting every student in that class ready for the instruction. And one of the things that Anita Archer's taught us is that when you set those bell ringers up, you should plan for success. You should give students every day a chance to be successful, a chance to respond, and take some data from that. And so when you think you can incorporate that goal into that bell ringer for those students with disabilities, and also you can capture the other of setting those students and setting the stage for the new learning that's about to happen, then you've done that and you've captured that. But that takes time, and it takes planning, and it takes addressing those content lessons at a high level. You have to plan. And we a few years ago we saw a shift away from lesson plans for special education teachers. And while I'm not proposing that they have to do anything else with a piece of paper, I'm also thinking this is more important than anything we do, is that intentional planning to teach these students and to move them to the next level. That's what the point of education is. And so as we move through, and I don't want to get too preachy here, but Dr. Benninghoff talks in her book about identifying the metacognitive processes that a successful learner might use. How does a successful learner think about solving that algebra problem? Is there a strategy that I use that's not one that's not typically taught? Have I asked other folks? Have I asked other colleagues? How would you teach this? There may be a couple of math teachers in the school, or you may go to the teacher in the grade level above and you say, how would you consider this lesson? And how would you look at this? How would you get this access for all here? One of the things that she talks a lot about is the use of mnemonics. And in order to remove the cognitive overload that students with memory issues experience, students with disabilities, a lot of our students have problems with memory, not just kids with IEP flags. And so when we start to teach them about mnemonics, she suggests that providing them with a mnemonic got my tongue twisted there for a second. I'm thinking about my 5th grade science class, and I was trying to learn the planets, and Mrs. Smith who was a tough teacher, but she taught us, Mary's violet eyes make Johnny stay up nights, period, as a mnemonic to remember the planets, right? You can remember that, Mary corresponds to Mercury and that kind of thing, and eyes, Earth. Those so but what Benninghoff says, if we give a mnemonic to a student, we've provided them with an accommodation. Okay. We've given them a tool. But when we take that mnemonic process and we teach the processes behind that, building our own mnemonic, what do we have to remember? How are we going to shorten it? How are we going to make it accessible to us? How are we going to make it mean something to us? So we have to teach our students that process. And when we teach them that process, rather than just giving them the accommodation, that's specially designed instruction. The same would be true for a graphic organizer. As we adapt the general approach, if we want to use a graphic organizer, if we just give a graphic organizer to the students and we say, hey, this is how you put this web map up together here, or this is how you would capture the three bullets from the main idea and the supporting details. But what you want to be after is lessons that incorporate the teaching of how to build your own graphic organizers, so that there's transfer and there's independence built in, and that you can generalize those to other settings. And that's what she's talking about as we adapt that general approach. How might we incorporate pre-teaching, visual, kinesthetic input, group instruction, explicit directions, chunking, and other alternative measures and methods as a better way of generalizing what's being taught, and then attending to necessary access or executive function skills. And when I think about this one, I think about those little kids, because my wife taught kindergarten for so long, and she would say, you have to teach the students routine. You have to teach them, if you're going to use centers, and she's big on centers, if you're going to use centers, if you're going to use station teaching in a co-teaching model, you have to teach those little ones the proper way to transition. Okay. Everything is a teaching moment. And so teaching executive functioning skills, working on retrieval of information from a blank slate to overcome memory issues, working on, managing our impulses, or checking our own work, those types of things. And look at, do we have all the tools we need to be successful? Can we plan? Can we manage time? Can we be on time? When students reach the 8th grade, if they're still having serious issues with time management, a lot of teachers will say, you should have learned that a long time ago. But the process here is students with disabilities need to continue to have instruction in being able to manage these executive functioning skills. And so she goes into that in depth. And then build in specific methods to boost participation. We talked a lot or some earlier about opportunities to respond. How can we build engagement? How can we make sure that every student feels invited to the table? How can we build in success so they'll want to continue on with the lesson? How can we use things like response cards and whiteboards and different signals, hand signals, to indicate and check for learning? One of the things that we do with specially designed instruction, not enough, is, are we assessing the understanding, and are we rebooting when students are not getting it? I heard a statistic once back a few years ago, and I think it was Dr. Anita Archer that talked about it. She's the explicit instruction guru that I refer to often. And it was such a life-changing experience for me to be able to be in the same room with her for 4 days, for 8 hours, and listen to her talk about instruction. But one of the things she said was, students with what we would consider in the average range intellect need 7 experiences with a new concept, and students with disabilities need 27 experiences with a new concept. So when we talk about boosting participation, we need to take that into consideration. How can we build into our lesson opportunities to respond and to practice more and to have more checks of understanding amongst our lesson? And so that's the residual is two things that we can all get on board with. and this is the last thing I'm going to say about boosting participation. Dr. Bates is prompting me on, and that's okay because I get a little wordy sometimes. I appreciate that. But the one thing we're going to get out of boosting participation is higher achievement. The second thing that we're going to get, and the research is very clear, is we're going to get less behavior that we're going to have to deal with. And we can all get on board with that because our scores are going to go up and our dockets are going to be a lot cleaner. And we're going to be able to be instructional leaders. When we ensure that these things are going on in our classrooms, we're going to be the true instructional leader in our school. And it's going to take us away from having to deal with all of these behavior issues that we deal with. And so, one of the things that I would say is we review a lot of files across the region. Brenda Combs and I do. And Dr. Bates joins us on that and some of our other staff sometimes. And when we look at those things, when we look at referral, and I know Dr. Bates teaches referral and she teaches, child find. One of the things that we see our folks not being able to do a good job with is ensuring that they're placing high leverage practices, peer reviewed, evidence-based practices on that referral to show that that student has had proper experiences in reading and mathematics, because that is a clear exclusion. If we're looking to see that if this student has a disability, if they haven't had those proper experiences, and if they haven't had those strategies that work, then we're, missing out. The other thing is when we get to the other side of the fence and we're looking at students' IEPs and we get down to that section under the goal and we're looking at what specially designed instruction we're using, that needs to link throughout the IEP. There needs to be an internal consistency within that IEP that starts with that present level and says, hey, these are the barriers this student's facing. These are the things that emanate from the disability. This is the adverse effect of the disability, and this is how we're going to attack it. And we're not seeing a very high level being captured in those two places. On the referral, when we're asking for that the data and we're looking at the evidence-based practices, we're not seeing that. And when we get to those, we're starting to see explicit instruction appear because we've hammered it. Like, that process of explicit instruction and that process of practicing and checking for understanding and giving feedback and repeating that process, modeling, teaching, practice, feedback. We're starting to see that, and that's great. But we need to make sure that when we look at those IEPs as principals, we can say, how does that specially designed instruction match that disability? How does it match the needs of that student? And what are the needs? What are the needs that we've identified in the present level? And so I just threw this in here, this last little piece here, high leverage practices related to implementing SDI. When we systematically design instruction toward a specific goal, that's what we're talking about. We see the barrier and we match it to the strategy. We are able to adapt the curriculum then. We're able to change the curriculum and provide the things that students need. When we teach cognitive and metacognitive processes, when we teach the learning behind the learning, and we teach students how to build their own graphic organizers and their own mnemonic devices that help them overcome. When we provide scaffolds, I think about my own learning as an adult. When I've got a model to go by, when I've got an example and a non-example, when I have the ability to access scaffolds, I do much better. When I can have an example to go by to show me, hey, this is kind of what it's supposed to look like. And so we need to be looking for that in our instruction. And of course, I've already highlighted the use of explicit instruction because I can talk about that all day long. I love that. And then the use of assistive technology. How can we incorporate technology into our specially designed instruction? And how can we make sure that when we do, that we're using things that are tried and true and have been peer reviewed and have evidence behind them that they actually work as a high leverage practice? So when we look at high leverage practices, what you see in this book over here on the right is what you're going to see. These pieces are found inside this book as ways to do specially designed instruction. And then that intensifying of the instruction and maintaining and generalizing learning to new settings. We talked about how we can use those tools that we show students how to build graphic organizers, how to build mnemonic devices, and they can take them with them throughout their educational careers. And then also providing that feedback is so vital. Checking for that understanding and going through that process of explicit instruction, modeling, teaching new concepts, providing examples, non-examples, checking for understanding, providing feedback, and doing that process over and over is so important when you talk about specially designed instruction. And that there's a research base to it, and it's right here in those high leverage practices.
Mr. May, I just wanted to let everyone know, I dropped it in the chat. There is a digital copy of the high leverage practices in special education book, and I dropped it in a link there so they can take a look at those practices and have their own copy. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then
Yeah.
one other thing I wanted to say is I wanted to back up. And
Uh-huh.
when you were talking a little bit earlier, Danielle had put a note in the chat that we had missed, and she was talking about when you were talking about the lessons, but she said fail to plan and plan to fail. And she was talking about when you were on the lesson plans going away for special education teachers. And she
I
was just
couldn't
talking
agree.
about,
I couldn't agree more with Danielle. And I get sour looks when I say we need to be looking for lesson plans amongst our special education teaching staff. But really, if we can move beyond what we talked about, just accommodating, we can accommodate without planning. We cannot teach content and teach and adapt methods and do all the work that is required of a special ed teacher without planning. And I agree with that 1000%. If you want to back up to the previous slides, I want to just highlight something that's in the participant folder as we move toward the end here. Each of these steps, I tried to take each of these steps and build out some strategies. And so you have that in your participant folder. So with each one of these steps, you're going to have some talk about how you go about clarifying the learning target. How do you pinpoint difficult moments? How do you incorporate different goals together in a lesson and make sure that you're hitting all of those? And as we move on, each one of these, and there's a big section on opportunities to respond. There's a big section on executive functioning. And so I just wanted to share that with you. That's something that you can pass along to your teachers, your special ed teachers. I think they would really gain from having that information in their hands, because it's a short but thick treatment of each of those pieces. And so you can move on to the next slide.
and I did want to say that we do have that, if they want to share the participant folder with teachers, they're welcome to do that. There's special ed and regular ed teachers, because there's the high leverage practices, there's this presentation, there's all those things that Mr. May put in there with the examples for each of those things as they're helping them to plan for SDI, because they may need a little bit of extra support as they're working through that and co-planning. So we just want to make that a resource available.
There's also another resource in there that talks about how we know specially designed instruction is being conducted. And we'll get to that in just a second. So here's, we hear these phrases, evidence-based practices and high leverage practices, kind of interchangeably. And so what's the difference? High leverage practices are based on a consensus among experts and best practices in education. May not have the same rigorous experimental validation as evidence-based practices. So, and then the evidence-based practices are high quality, peer-reviewed research. Sometimes we say, oh, it's evidence-based, but you really have to search behind the lines and look a little deeper and make sure that it's been peer-reviewed, because peer-reviewed means it's independent review of that. If you buy a program that's supposed to do all your specially designed instruction for you, the company that does that's going to do their own research, and they're going to give you some data, and it's going to say that it's effective, right? But we need to look for independent evidence reviews of peer-reviewed research to make sure that we're using things that are tried and true and that work. And of course, evidence-based practices are mandated under IDEA. We're supposed to be using these things not only in our interventions with our MTSS programs and our RTI, we're supposed to be using them with specially designed instruction. Okay, you can move to the next one. So back up just one, you jump. I think there's one there. So high leverage practices focus on the how of teaching and the interactions, such as implementing universal strategies effectively, For example, it's the use of explicit instruction. That's a high leverage practice. Okay. And then the evidence-based practices may look at the what and why of teaching, addressing specific challenges through those validated methods. And a good example of that might be the Orton-Gillingham method of teaching phonics, or the U-Fly method that Chastity so aptly teaches throughout the region. And so that's the difference between high leverage and evidence-based. And here's just a little bit of a graphic here. When you're looking at focus, you got high leverage practice, evidence-based practice. When we're talking about instruction, it might be explicit instruction is the overall high leverage practice, and then drill down to that phonics program that's specific to that student's need. And then when we're looking at assessment, we're looking at ongoing progress. But then with an evidence-based practice, we might be looking at that specific curriculum-based measure that we're using. And then with behavior, that broad piece with positive behavior, which is required if students have behaviors that are interfering with their learning or interfering with others' learning. We're supposed to be teaching them the replacement behaviors. That's a big piece. But then, evidence-based practice might be highlighting how we establish routines in that kindergarten classroom, how we establish routines and how we teach that. And then the collaboration, we might, with high leverage practices, we make sure that we're collaborating with families. But then with an evidence-based practice, we may build that out to some specific training for behavior. So those are, a little bit of a highlight on what the difference between is high leverage practice and evidence-based practice. Sometimes we use terms interchangeably, and we don't really realize that we're doing that almost. And it's like accommodation modification. Sometimes same thing occurs. So I wanted to kind of break that down just a little bit for you. And then I said the last thing I was going to talk about, and we're just about here to the end. The last thing I was going to talk about is when you do your walkthroughs, when you look at what's going on in those classrooms, when you're looking for evidence of specially designed instruction, what have you done that's special today? What have you done that's going to highlight a goal that a student has on the IEP? Because students with IEPs are who qualify for specially designed instruction. Now, incidental benefits part of that. But do we have a goal that we're working on? What's that goal? So you might ask your teachers, hey, what did you work on that was special today? What was different from the core instruction? How did you broaden that lesson to hit all corners of the room? And so is it special? Is it intentional to a goal? Do we take data on it? Is it bringing about, can we show that we've checked for understanding, that we've captured some data around movement? Have we been able to move those students? Have we built in some independence? Have we been able to bolster our teaching and our instruction so that students learn how to build their own tools that are independent making? Okay. And what I mean by that, I've used those examples to death, but they're good examples. Can you take and instruct students? Can you make sure that they know how to build a mnemonic device or a graphic organizer? And then have we also built in to our lessons multiple checks for understanding and multiple opportunities for our students to respond to the instruction? Are we ensuring that students are not just on the computer at the end of the lesson, or they're in a corner working on individual? Are we giving them opportunities to be engaged and part of the mainstream of that classroom? And that's huge. I appreciate you guys being here with us, and we're always available to build this out a little further in your district. So, holler at us if you need us. We're happy to talk about specially designed instruction all day long. Thank you, guys.
Yes. Any questions or comments or thoughts?
Yeah.
The only thing I wanted to say is just as we are talking about that instruction and circling back to the real thinking around how we know about instruction and how we can monitor it, is thinking about the data and thinking about how we know how our students with disabilities are performing and how we can look at that. To decide, is it an instructional issue? And is our specially designed instruction, are we providing students with that strong specially designed instruction? Are we using those evidence-based practices? And we added the high leverage practices just for you because that come from the Cedar Foundation and the Council for Exceptional Children. So they brought together, all of the research that is kind of a meta-analysis around the research about what practices we know that work real well. And one of the things that are real common across all of those are explicit instruction, but how can we help teachers understand what that explicit instruction looks like? But that we use data that can continue to cycle and circle back around, always checking along the way to see how our students with disabilities are performing in regards to other students, but keeping a kind of a finger on the pulse of how the data is at our school. And that can help us plan and provide the level of support that our students need. Thank you all, and we appreciate you being with us.